This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our July IT ANZ seminar on micromobility. In today's seminar, we have four valued speakers. The first speaker is Joshua Travis. He's an urban planner at RACV. Josh has a passion for the role of transport in placemaking and strengthening communities. Josh is currently looking into how Victorians perceive their transport network and how their experience can be used to guide the future of transport and land use planning. Then we have Julia Hunter. She's Senior Manager, Strategic Partnership and Growth in Mobility for RACV. She has broad experience across sustainability, marketing, and stakeholder engagement. She is currently the Senior Manager of Strategic Partnership and Growth in Mobility for RACV. In her role, Julia is responsible for establishing integrated partnerships with transport service providers across all modes of transport, from micromobility to car share and public transport to ride-hailing. Julia has qualifications in marketing, management, and environmental management, and Julia is particularly interested in smart solutions for sustainable transport. Then we have Tom Cooper. He's the General Manager of Australia and New Zealand at Beam. Tom is one of the most experienced e-mobility operators, having been involved in a setup of operations for Beam in Adelaide, Sydney, Canberra, Brisbane, Wellington, Auckland, and Townsville. He's passionate about creating alternative forms of sustainable transport for cities across the region. And last but not the least, we have Hafez Alavi, the transport lead at HA Consulting. Hafez is passionate about road safety and sustainable mobility. His vision is an inclusive future where every journey is safe and sustainable. Hafez has over 20 years of experience in transport planning and sustainable mobility across the public and private sectors, and also in academia. He completed his PhD at Monash University Accident Research Center, where he researched into road safety and injury prevention. As the previous director of the Safe System Road Infrastructure Program at TAC in Victoria, Hafez has made significant contributions to the Victorian government's ambitious Towards Zero strategy and action plan. Currently, he's the transport lead for the HA Consulting, and he collaborates with a wide range of organizations within Australia and internationally to fight serious road trauma and promote active and sustainable transport modes. Before going to our seminar, I just want to have an overview of the Institute of Transportation Engineers Australia and New Zealand section, which is your pathway to international fellowship in transport. ITANZ is an international membership association of transport profession who works on the mobility and safety for all transportation system users. Currently, we have over 15,000 members in 90 countries, and we always welcome new members. We have great sponsors: Austraffic, which is our platinum sponsor; Cedro Solutions, which sponsors the President's Dinner and Postgrad Awards. We have also Traffic Works, which sponsors the Student Award. We have RACV, which sponsors the annual breakfast, and also we have Arup and O'Brien Traffic as our valued sponsors. And before moving on to the seminar, I would like to do the acknowledgement of the country. On behalf of the RTANZ, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Wurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we meet today. We respectfully acknowledge the ancestors and elders, past and present. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians and the ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia and New Zealand. And also, I want to thank the organizing committee of these seminars. Daniel, David, Matt, Ro, and Christian did a great job in setting up the seminars, inviting the guest speakers, and running everything very smoothly. Many thanks to them. And also, I would like to have a couple of housekeeping issues. Please remain on mute, and please don't ask any questions during the presentations. If there is any question, it would be great if you put your questions through the chat, and then at the end of the presentations, I will read the questions to the speakers and seek their answers. Thank you very much. And we will start with the first presenter, Joshua. Over to you, please, Josh.
Hi all. Once again, well, thank you all so much for having us here. Thank you to ITE for inviting us. It's going to be great to talk to this topic. I'm Josh, I'm from RACV. So, oh, someone, okay. Yeah, I'm Josh, I'm from RACV, and today I'm going to be talking about micromobility and more specifically, mostly about e-scooters. We here at RACV really see e-scooters as a way for to address some of the issues that are starting to occur in Melbourne as the city grows beyond 5 million people. We need to scale and change the way that we function our every day-to-day trips as a result of this, because congestion and road safety are all becoming much more prominent issues, will become more prominent issues as the city grows. So one thing, so just for people that aren't aware of what an e-scooter is, I imagine most people here would be, but just in case. So an e-scooter is a form of micromobility. It generally has 2 wheels aboard 2 handlebars. Sometimes it has more wheels. There's e-scooter schemes currently in place in cities like Brisbane and Adelaide in Australia at the moment. E-scooters also, unfortunately, there's a bit of conflict because people have started to purchase them, but the problem is they're not necessarily entirely legal depending on what you purchase. So if you purchase an e-scooter that is over 200 watts, that goes faster than 10 kilometers an hour on level ground, and use that on a public road or footpath, that's illegal, and you can get a fairly big fine as a result of that, unfortunately. A lot of people aren't aware of this, so this is an issue, especially when like e-scooter last year or the year before, prior to the Christmas rush, there was a mass, like e-scooters were being sold off the shelves everywhere. So we had this idea of, due to the increase in sales, that we'd come up with a survey to kind of gather sentiment and see what public awareness is around e-scooters, which brings me into my next page. So we developed this survey as as I said before, it was mainly to gather sentiment and see how people are perceiving these devices that have just started to really emerge in Victoria. We realized that there might be a bit of a gap, a knowledge gap for everyday people. Some people might not necessarily know what they are. Some people might think that they're a mobility scooter. So we really wanted to make it clear that this is what they are. Please tell us what you think. And so we established a Royal Auto article, which is RACV's publication, and we published that online, and we sent out a digital EDM. We promoted this survey on Facebook and Twitter, and you had to go through the digital newsletter first, find out what an e-scooter was, and then at the bottom of that you could go through the survey. So this survey received 1,442 responses and went for approximately 3 weeks. Interestingly enough, these survey results shocked us a fair bit. And when we asked people if they'd consider using an e-scooter, 79% of survey respondents said they would, and this was fairly consistent among different age groups as well. So if, like, for example, people aged 65 to 74, 62% of them said they'd like to use an e-scooter. So we were quite shocked by those statistics at the time, but that's fantastic. When we dug a bit deeper and we asked for like the main reason people want to use them, the environment came up as a pretty prominent thing. So better for the environment than a car. People want the freedom to go where they want, and they want to avoid congestion. We did see a considerable amount of responses from this survey as well, also came from people living in outer metropolitan areas where it might be a bit more, public transport may be more infrequent, or there's issues with station car parking and congestion. So when we followed that up further and asked what trips people would like to use e-scooters for, that the #1 response was to get to public transport, followed by recreational fun, and #3 was to go to work. And I believe go to work was more prominent among inner city people, but overall it came third. We also asked people where they thought appropriate place for e-scooters to be used, and the common response was, well, the most prominent response was shared path and bicycle paths, followed by bicycle lanes, and then on roads with speed limits under 50 kilometers or less. There was a lot of interest in rental e-scooter schemes as well, with 71% of people in Victoria, or the respondents, not people in Victoria, the respondents saying that that they should be legal, and that they'd like to see rental e-scooter scheme operators in the state. There was a lot of comments in there from people living in outer metropolitan Melbourne as well about issues getting to and from the station, and ultimately a lot of the feedback came to them seeing it as a first and last mile solution. We actually got a lot of feedback from the Point Cook Wyndham LGA. To our surprise, we marketed and sponsored the survey on Facebook across the state and to all our members, but that area was just a focus area of the results. We also asked people that weren't interested in riding an e-scooter, or like why they wouldn't consider using one. And the prominent results that we got was they don't trust other like road users, the infrastructure is not safe enough, and that they don't suit their needs. And all throughout this survey, there was a consistent theme of safety being the main concern. So the takeaways we got from this is that the survey revealed that there's a strong support for e-scooters, whether that be personal or rental schemes. The issue is non-road rule compliant e-scooters are here currently, people are using them, but the legislation and the infrastructure might just not, it's not there yet. We're seeing these e-scooter hire and share schemes expand globally and more in a local context as well. So now is the time where we need to really influence this and make sure that people aren't legally riding illegal devices, and encourage uptake, healthy uptake where possible. So yeah, and I think we still need to acknowledge that they're not without concern. There is a safety element to them that does need to be addressed. So following on from this, when we're putting this policy, our stance and our policy positioning together, we're engaging with the National Transport Commission. And for those that aren't familiar, the National Transport Commission are currently working to amend the Australian road rules to incorporate personal mobility devices, which is what e-scooters falls under. And the Australian road rules are set as, I guess, to really simplify it, a guideline that the states and territories can then adopt within their own locations, and it works towards potentially having a more cohesive and consistent road rules framework between each of the states and territories. And that was something that we thought was really important from our perspective at RACV, as we do have towns that share a borderline And we also, like, who would use e-scooters? It could very well be tourists, it could very well be locals, but people, when they go interstate, it helps to have consistent rules, especially when one state says you can ride on the footpath and if another one says you can't. This is a little bit of a tangent here, but as it's the topic of micromobility, I wanted to talk about another project we've worked on, and I'll come back to the e-scooter stuff at the end. But we ran an e-bike trial in Bendigo, and this was in partnership with La Trobe University. So for this, we lent 8 e-bikes to participants that went to, participants or university students that worked in the medical sector that would be likely to have to ride between the hospital in Bendigo and the university. And we wanted to see if we could influence their mode change. So get people for trips that would otherwise be in a car. Could we, in a smaller city like Bendigo, could we influence that so that they'd be more likely to ride an e-bike? And we got some pretty interesting findings out of this. I guess it was, yes, people would. So 9 out of 10 of the people in the trial, or not 9 out of 10, the people in the trial rated the e-bike an average of 9 out of 10 by the final week. So people were really happy with the e-bikes that they got, and the primary purpose that they used them for was commuting, and they used them quite regularly, and they did replace their car trips. However, we did find a consistent thing, and that was if it was cold, wet, or windy, and the participants told us this themselves, that they did not want to ride their e-bike. And this trial also took place in Bendigo in June and July of 2019. So it was a cold, wet, and windy time. Unfortunately, still great results though. So this was taken into consideration as we continued our advocacy on e-scooters as well, and as we formed our policy position and as it continues to grow, we just want to call out the safe system principles. So in honor of all the work Hafez has done. So this was something that we think is the utmost important when new mobility especially is emerging, that there's a way for us to acknowledge how a mistake's going to occur, and acknowledging that they will occur and how they can be avoided, acknowledging that people will, like, that the roads and footpaths, the streets in general are shared spaces, and that conflict needs to be avoided. These, like, legislation and infrastructure needs to work to avoid this. And the 4 main pillars of this that we see as importance that we considered were safe roads, safe speeds, safe vehicles, and safe people. Emphasis on the safe people part at the end. So ultimately, these were the key positions that we came up with when we spoke with the National Transport Commission. We wanted to see nationally consistent road rules among the states and territories. We've called for a national framework that would allow e-scooters to travel at 25 kilometers on most roads, bicycle lanes, bicycle paths, and shared paths, and 10 kilometers on footpaths. Personal mobility devices like e-scooters have a potential to ease congestion and provide a more sustainable transport option. And we think that this is really important, especially for addressing those gaps that we have in outer metro Melbourne, or just the middle section of Melbourne, which where transport may not be as efficient as it is in the intersection, and just a way to get people out of cars too. And finally, we think that we support the legislation of e-scooters. We think it's great. We'd love to see them, but we also understand that Melbourne, in terms of infrastructure, is not entirely there yet. We need that safe and separated bicycle infrastructure that e-scooters can use. We need, where possible, to separate e-scooters from pedestrians, and we need, where possible, to separate e-scooters from vehicles. And as a part of that, we're constantly liaising with government and other stakeholders to achieve that, because we think that's really important. And that's it from me, so I'll hand this over to Julia.
Thank you, Josh. And Josh is going to be my slide changer, everyone, because that minimises tech issues caused by me. But I can see a few people have joined since Josh started speaking. So just briefly, I'm Julia. I'm also from RACV. I'm the Senior Manager of Partnerships and Growth across all modes of transport for RACV, including micromobility. And my background is environmental sustainability and corporate social responsibility. So you might see me get a bit more excited about the topics of my presentation that sit in that space. And I work predominantly on a product that's called Arrivo. And I'll explain through my presentation a bit more about what Arrivo is and how it's relevant to micromobility. The other thing I would add is I'm in a household with 3 people, and yet somehow we have 7 bikes. So I'm living the micromobility experience in my home life as well as in the workplace. Now, I'm sure most of us on the call are sort of well aware of, you know, the challenges that exist in the space of transport. So, you know, congestion, particularly when it comes to peak hour, the challenges of first and last mile transport, the conflict that can sometimes exist between road infrastructure and bike infrastructure, like we see there with the car door opening into the bike lane. And then more recently, particularly for Melbourne, with the extent of the lockdowns that we've had, we've seen empty roads and empty public transport. And yet that has been, you know, somewhat balanced out with a significant increase in cycling for recreational purposes and an opportunity perhaps to put in some more bike infrastructure, such as the pop-up bike lane that we see on the top right hand there. And there's quite a bit of that activity going on in Melbourne as well. Could we go to the next slide? Thanks, Josh. You're a star. Beautiful. And so then alongside of this, you know, if we take a broader lens, you know, what's also going on globally, and I'm sure that Tom will talk a bit about this as well, but massive increase in use of shared micromobility, and particularly massive increase in the use of e-scooters as well. And when we look across parts of Europe as well, we see that e-bike sales are outstripping e-car sales. And in fact, in the Netherlands at the moment, e-bikes outsell traditional bikes. Next slide, thanks, Josh. Beautiful. And you're probably, I love numbers. So here we go, here's some more numbers. So what do I keep my eye on? So in Australia, e-bike sales have been growing at 50% for the past 3 years. So that is amazing growth. And whilst bike sales generally did go up across the board last year because, you know, everyone wanted to spend their, you know, their 1 hour or their recreation time doing something. So bike sales went up significantly, but e-bike sales significantly outstripped the growth that you see in traditional bike sale growth over that same period. The other thing I always think is interesting is to look at spend profiles. So again, like these are pre-COVID numbers, so let's take them with a grain of salt. But, you know, pre-COVID, the average Australian household was spending 14% of their household income on transport. So for Melburnian households, that looked like something like $20,000 a year. So there is a significant economic drivers as well to consider in terms of mode change in transport. Cycling participation, like I just mentioned, so it's actually a 69% measured increase participation in cycling of pre and post COVID levels, and that's drawing on the bike network data. And the other thing that I think is interesting, particularly from a Victoria perspective, is the Victorian government's recent announcements about carbon reduction strategy also includes a commitment to increase active transport to 25% of all journeys. Now that's up from, I believe, at the most recent measure from 18%. So that's a significant shift that we need to achieve by 2030 and will require mode shift between private vehicle, particularly private combustion engine vehicle, into some more sustainable and active modes like walking and bikes. Now, e-bikes and e-scooters, and particularly e-scooters, aren't necessarily defined as active transport, but, you know, if we think of it as a spectrum, we will need to see people moving into some of those micromobility modes to help us achieve that active transport target as well. Next slide, thanks, Josh. Fabulous. Also, I think interesting is when we look at the data. So what we're seeing here is Department of Transport data from 2018. Now, this is Journeys to Work, and journeys to work for Victorians. But we can see, that a significant, the vast majority of these journeys are sitting in that sort of less than 20 or less than 15 kilometres. Now, whilst generally what we would see is that the relationship between people wanting to cycle to work, their, intent or interest in cycling to work decreased as dramatically as the distance increases. But what e-bikes and e-scooters can do is help to extend that distance for which people are willing to engage with, an e-bike or an e-scooter as part of their journey to work. So what we could see, and I think will see, is an increasing mode shift out of what is, you can see there, predominantly private vehicle and perhaps also some PT into these micromobility modes like e-bikes and e-scooters. The other thing is, of course, most of us are probably familiar, but the beautiful thing about e-bikes as well is they let people continue to engage with biking, beyond age or mobility restrictions that might otherwise have seen them sort of shift from biking into private vehicle or PT as well. All right, next one, Josh. This is great. I should have you all the time, Josh. Okay, so at the beginning, I mentioned that I work predominantly on a product called Arrivo. So what is Arrivo? So Arrivo is, about RACV's recognition that we want to be able to help all Victorians to get around sustainably, conveniently, efficiently, and that is not limited to just private motor vehicle use. So one of the things that RACV has invested in is Arrivo, which is currently a journey planning app. So what it enables people to do at the moment is to plan their journeys across private vehicle, public transport, bikes, and walking. But what it also is the beginnings of what would be a mobility as a service application. Now, mobility as a service is an emerging and dynamic area. It's more mature in some parts of Europe and relatively immature in Australia. But what the vision of MAS, or mobility as a service, is to have a seamless planning, booking and payment with a single customer interface. So the future vision for Arrivo is to let Victorians come into that, what is currently a journey planning interface, and say, right, I want to get from Richmond into the city, and it will present a number of options that will include micromobility options and PT and private vehicle and ride hailing, and it will let you book and pay for those journeys. Now, is that going to happen next week? No, it's not. But it is the longer term ambition and transition that we would expect to see as uptake around collaborative consumption of transport options and uptake of micromobility increases over time. Next slide, please, Josh. Brilliant. So you can see in that way, Arrivo is one, lever. Journey planning and MAS is one lever you can pull to help people to understand how they can use micromobility in their journey planning and how to plan their routes using micromobility as their option. But there are a large number of levers that exist to promote micromobility. I'm not going to list all of these out, but I would draw attention to a few in particular. So obviously laws and regulations play an important role. Now, as Josh mentioned, in Victoria at the moment, e-scooters are largely illegal, which doesn't stop people necessarily using them. And in fact, this morning I was, I had a smile as I sat on the train and saw a public transport worker ride up on his e-scooter to the train, hop on the train, fold up his e-scooter and continue his journey. So, it's happening in advance of those regulations, but obviously not ideal that the lived experience at the moment is in conflict with those regulations. With that said, the plan is for Victoria's regulations to be amended this year to allow an e-scooter trial to go ahead, which is very exciting for us, and I'm sure many of you in other states and in New Zealand who already have e-scooters are wondering why we don't have them yet, but hopefully by spring of this year we'll have that. So laws and regulations are really important as levers to enable micromobility. Incentives as well, and perhaps we don't have a lot of incentives that exist necessarily in Australia, but if we look further afield to places like the UK that have long established programs via the government where employees can access significant discounts to cycling, to bikes and bike accessories packaged up by their employers, and they've been able to measure significant increases in cycling participation that they attribute to that, so incentives can play a role. Infrastructure, and Josh mentioned this as well in terms of our RACV policy positions. So infrastructure above all other levers. So having safe and dedicated and separated cycling lanes for both e-bikes, bikes, and also e-scooters is by far the biggest driver in terms of helping people to feel more confident and them starting to participate in those modes of transport. And to help articulate that, I've just popped another diagram on this slide there, and you can see, so the bottom one there, where it's 83% of people feel confident, is where we see the separated bike lane. So you've got kind of, for example, the concrete kind of build up between the bike lane and the road. So a significant increase in the levels of confidence that people have, from, where you've just got kind of perhaps the dotted line on the street, where yes, there's some hardcore cyclists who'll happily get out there and feel very confident, but, we're certainly not seeing a lot of kids or women participating in cycling with that level of infrastructure. So the improvements are needed if we want uptake in micromobility across generations, confidence levels, and genders as well. Next slide, thanks, Josh. Okay, so this is hot off the press. In line with some of the recent investments made in cycling infrastructure across some of the central Melbourne areas in particular, City of Melbourne, City of Port Phillip and City of Yarra commissioned our team, our Arevo team, to do a bit of work around bike behaviour and increasing bike confidence in particular. So that means over the course of 3 months earlier this year, we ran a series of bike confidence workshops. We built a Let's Ride Melbourne website. We ran a marketing campaign and a series of surveys, all designed to help build confidence around bike riding, particularly for people who weren't already confident cyclists. And we've been able to measure the benefit across participants or people that were touched by that program, so that the audience that we reached. And it's been really compelling. So you can see there, so 59% of non-confident riders now feel confident from participating in some way in that program. 84% feel capable to ride safely after interacting with the program. 51% were aware of the new bike infrastructure, and keeping in mind that we're talking about, Melbourne as well, which has had extensive lockdowns, and so not everyone's sort of been back in the city or moving around as much. So that was very pleasing for the councils to see. 46% of people who participated are now riding more for transport, and 68% were motivated to ride more. So what we can see is that combination of activities, including workshops designed to help boost confidence, providing the information to people as to where safe bike routes are, information around what sort of bike you need to get, what's the right gear, and all of that is also very important to complement the bike infrastructure to help get more beginner cyclists out on the road as well. Let's pop to the next slide. Thanks, Josh. And one thing, again, drawing on the work that I do with the Arevo and the journey planning app. So one of the key tools we used as Let's Ride Melbourne was a specific bike mapping feature that we built within Arevo. Now, perhaps a bike map doesn't sound that as exciting, but actually when we stop to think about it, what we could see is that whilst the information is out there in terms of where bike lanes are, where bike infrastructure is, where shared pathways are, it's not necessarily there in a way that is easily usable by end users. So as a bike rider, if I want to, plan my journey from home into the office, and I want to know the best route for me to go on, that is going to preference dedicated bike lanes or shared bike pathways, there's not really anywhere I can go at the moment. So this is why we built this feature within Arrivo. And I bring it to your attention because whilst Arrivo is that journey planner across all those modes of transport, what we actually see is that bike journey planning is consistently the second most used mode of transport within the app. So, and that's, you know, compared to PT and private vehicle and all of that. And actually in some periods, particularly late in the summer, we saw that the bike mapping feature was being utilised more than those other modes combined. So, you know, it tells us that people are definitely interested and that people want this information around where the safe bike infrastructure is and how to help them get from point A to B in a way that they can feel safer and more confident. Now, this has been bike focused at the moment because we haven't had e-scooters in Melbourne, but there is obviously some applicability, particularly given the e-scooter trial for Melbourne will keep e-scooters limited to shared bike pathways, dedicated bike lanes, and will keep them off pedestrian pathways and footpaths, for example. So there's some shared learnings we're hoping to see across that as well. And what I think is my final slide, Josh. We lost, there we go. And I just thought I'd put this up here because I always find it, you know, interesting, you know, mobility utopia. What does the future look like? You know, autonomous vehicles, you know, e-scooters, you know, drones doing the fleet work, for example. So I think it's always interesting to think about the role that micromobility is going to play in that future transport scenario, which, you know, may be closer than sometimes we think it is. So, you know, why can't we get to our destination in a way that's faster and cheaper and more sustainable? And why can't getting from A to B be more than just, you know, a functional journey? You know, why can't that be an experience in itself? And I guess my overwhelming experience of e-scooters in particular so far, it's not, you know, necessarily, oh, I used it to get from here to there and I went 5Ks and it took me this long. When you watch someone on an e-scooter, they're happy. Like they're genuinely enjoying the experience that they're having of getting from point A to B, which is a different way, I think, of thinking about transport than perhaps, you know, a traditional, literally get me from point A to B as fast as I can possibly get there. And the other thing I would, we're starting to think about as well is, you know, what can micromobility do in terms of meeting some of the logistic and fleet needs? Now, obviously, we see more of that on the roads than perhaps we realise at the moment. So the massive increase in food delivery, a large part of that is being delivered through e-bike fleets, for example, but there's plenty of opportunity, particularly in dense city areas, for micromobility to replace vehicles for certain logistical and business purposes as well. So I think Tom is coming up next. It would be remiss of me not to say that we have a partnership with Beam. So I think we're lucky to hear from Tom today. One of the reasons we're excited about partnering with Beam is their commitment to safety, as well as their presence in Asia Pacific and their carbon neutrality. So I told you I'd get excited about the sustainability stuff. So I think we're lucky to have him here as well. So I'll hand over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Julia. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now? Yep. Getting some nods, and everyone can see the screen. Just present mode. Beautiful. So my journey into micromobility was sort of a coincidental sort of coming together of a number of factors. I've been working in software for a number of years, and the last company that I was working with, we were using IoT to track valuable assets around hospitals, car yards, and a number of other businesses. And what it really sort of triggered me was we could then have a ventilator that would normally had to be kept in a really narrow space where everyone knew exactly where it was. That ventilator, because it was being tracked, could actually be used by more people. And that was, you know, a moment that really triggered my fascination with shared mobility. I was in London. We were using the docked bike scheme around London, and it just opened up the city. And what we realized was that for mobility to succeed, there needs to be a density of vehicles. So London, for instance, had 750 docks and about 13,000 bikes. And so fast forward a couple of years after seeing that, e-scooters burst onto the scene. And what I really loved about e-scooters was that they were using IoT and they were just so accessible to people. It really opened up how cities could move, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. Just jump down. So today, sorry, my screen's just, there we go. So today I'm going to touch on where Beam operates, the vehicles that we're using, how we can provide accessibility, and how micromobility is helping around tourism and events. And then, a couple of things that Julia and Josh touched on was, the rise of ownership in electric vehicles, and in particular e-scooters, and how that, affects our business. So Beam is the largest operator in APAC. We run about 35,000 vehicles, and we're in South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Thailand. And one of the interesting things is Seoul in South Korea is actually one of the most densely populated cities with e-scooters. There's about 12 operators there, and around about 55,000 vehicles on the street. So huge numbers. But it works really, really well. And what we've seen is that the uptake just continues to get stronger and stronger each quarter. So a little bit closer to home, we're in Adelaide, Adelaide Coast, Canberra, Sydney. We run e-bikes, Bunbury, Townsville, and we're launching in Brisbane in a couple of weeks or 10 days. And then in New Zealand, Auckland and Wellington. And so, the e-scooter regulations, as have been touched on previously on this call, it's kind of a triple layered scheme where the federal government controls the importation of the scooters. Then the state governments control the legislation around where they can be used. And then the local governments actually manage and operate the scheme. So it's quite complex, and the National Transport Commission has handed down their findings, and I believe that the states are looking at those findings and some plan to accept them and roll them out, and others are looking at how it fits into their current frameworks. Sorry, next slide. So the evolution of the shared e-scooter. So I'm just showing our vehicles here because we know them quite well. But when we started out, electric scooters were the retail models with an IoT device attached to them. So all the challenges were that they didn't really last particularly well. They weren't built for the rough and tumble of the shared space. But as we've gone forward, 2019, we saw 50% battery capacity, larger frame, etc., coming on board. By early 2010-20, we were seeing Generation 3 scooters. So we're seeing swappable batteries, rubberized wheels, really strong, sturdy kickstands. And now we're in late 2020, we're seeing Generation 4 scooters. So we're seeing 120-kilometer range on the vehicles, hydraulic suspension, incredible accuracy on IoT. So we're getting that down to sort of like sub 1 meter in some areas. Anti-tipping kickstands, because obviously that was a big concern for cities when they first launched, that scooters were tipped over. So I think operators have really embraced the challenge that the cities have put down to them, saying we want e-scooters in our cities, but we need you to sort of solve these challenges. And I think operators are doing that, and it's becoming really, really exciting. And as Julia sort of mentioned a little bit earlier, when people hop on, and this is what gives me a huge thrill, is people hop on our vehicles and you see the smile and how it lights up their faces, and it just opens up the city. So it's really, really exciting for us to see more markets opening up, and we hope that Victoria will have a pilot program in the next couple of months. So just a little bit more about the vehicles, and as Julia mentioned, safety is our #1 priority. We want to have the safest vehicles on the road, and so all of our wires are concealed, so there can be no tampering. We've got 3 brakes on our e-scooters and 2 on our bikes, hydraulic suspension, Bluetooth helmet locks, so we can make sure that every vehicle has a helmet, indicator lights. So I think there's been a number of questions in the chat already about where vehicles should be, and currently in most markets they're on the sidewalk or footpath, but we do envisage a world where they head into bike lanes and onto sort of lower speed roads like bikes do now. So the indicators become a really crucial feature. So one of the big things about electric scooters and e-bikes is that they open up transport and make it accessible for everyone, creating better cities. And this study was undertaken by the Auckland University, and it's groundbreaking research, and comparing 4 cities, Perth, Vancouver, Auckland, and Brisbane. And their analysis used census data regarding population and income and open mapping technology to assess distribution of transport accessibility. As illustrated in the maps, the dark red hex is the priority areas that they assessed that needed the most help with transportation, because there's a correlation between 30 minutes of travel time and being able to find employment. So households where you've got to travel for more than 30 minutes and there's no public transport find it really hard to get into the working environment and find a job. And this this sort of perpetuates the poverty cycle where people just cannot get access to good public transport. And what we're finding with the e-scooters is that they actually allow the catchment area of public transport to increase significantly. So a 15-minute walk or a 30-minute walk, is cut in a third when people are riding an e-scooter or an e-bike. And if people, we have most operators now, but we do as well, have affordability programs where those that need transportation help the most are able to contact us, and we can provide that where they can get discounted rates to ride. So I think it's really important that for cities to grow, and we can't just keep building roads and new train lines. We need to increase the catchment area of what we have, and e-scooters and e-bikes can definitely play a part in that. So one of the things that we're seeing is driving tourism expenditure. There's a lot of people that previously, hopefully very soon, will be coming back to cities around Australia as tourists. And what they used to do is, they'd be public transport, walk, explore cities. But now with e-scooters and e-bikes, they can actually explore further and see more of the city. And this comes back to what I saw when I was in London in 2018, where we were using the docked e-bikes and we saw parts of London that we'd never seen before and we never would have seen if we were just on the tube or using a taxi. It allows you to immerse yourself in the city, and you just have to go down in Brisbane or Adelaide or Townsville and just see the vibrancy that people out of cars and onto the street brings. And I think it's really important. Melbourne has had an incredibly tough period over the last 18 months. And we think that e-scooters and e-bikes in Melbourne will really help revitalise, the city of Melbourne and bring people back into the CBD. So we're really excited and hopeful that something will happen there in the coming months. And then just finally touching on e-scooters, shared versus owned. We're now seeing between 3,000 and 5,000 trips per day across some markets in ANZ. So, it's becoming more and more popular. We're seeing commuters, leisure trips, but we're seeing that really regular usage now, where it's becoming apparent that we need more vehicles in cities. And just for, so some basic numbers, in Brisbane, for instance, there's roughly 2.5 million people, and as of next Friday, there'll be 2,800 electric devices across e-scooters and e-bikes. So that's about one e-mobility device per 890 people. But what we see in other cities around the world is Austin, for instance, they have one micro-mobility device for every 60 people, Lisbon 42 people per device, and then Beijing's the leader, and they have one electric vehicle or mobility device per 25 people. So you can see that there's a huge sort of scope for the density of vehicles to succeed. And what we find often is that when we put more vehicles into markets, the usage actually increases because people realize that they can now rely on e-scooters, e-bikes as a viable form of transportation. So, we hope in time that a lot of the cities will increase their allocations, and we've already seen it. Brisbane started with 1,000 electric scooters 2 years ago, and now they're up to 2,000. Adelaide started with 1,000, they're now well over 2,000 as well. So, cities are becoming more and more confident with it and realize the benefits that it can offer. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see, and this goes to Julia's point as well, like the spike in e-bike sales throughout the world has been huge, but local retailers that we're talking to and seeing are saying that they're now selling 2 e-scooters for every 1 e-bike they sell. So I think, e-scooters, e-bikes, they have a sort of part to play in the jigsaw. Scooter trips are generally 0 to 3 kilometers, and then the bikes are 3 to 8 kilometers. So there's a nice mix, and a lot of cities are adopting both forms. But what retail is great for us as well. If someone's out there buying an e-bike and an e-scooter, they're more likely to use the shared service. You can't always have your own bike with you. And so if those people don't, they're far more likely to jump on a shared device rather than hopping in a taxi. Beautiful. And just final, so obviously environment's really important to us. We're climate neutral certified. We're the first company or the first mobility company to have that certification in Australia and New Zealand, something that we're really proud of. And it's something that we sort of focus on maintaining. And so that comes back to using electric vehicles to swap our batteries. Every vehicle that we have in our fleet has a swappable battery, so they don't need to leave the street, and we just need to charge the batteries and take them to the vehicles. So that is all I had for this afternoon. I will now pass on to Fiz.
Thank you very much, Tom, and just wanted to say hello to everyone and thank you for your participation today. My name is Hafez Alavi I'm from the HA Consulting. Just checking my voice and the presentation come through nicely. Cool. Just wanted to acknowledge ITE and also your participation. Been reading your comments and questions in the background and in the chat room. Fantastic. I'm looking forward to have discussions about some of your questions. Today in my presentation, I'm going to talk about why safety is important. Of course, in some of my holidays pre-COVID, I have enjoyed riding e-scooters, which is the focus of my presentation today. I also, as a safety practitioner, am aware of some of the potential ways that we can improve their safety. So I'm going to talk about that today. Also, I'm going to share some data about the safety aspect of e-scooters and in the same micromobility, and also some practical ways in terms of safe systems that we can enhance their safety. Now, in terms of why safety matters, I'm going to borrow a case that has been published by the Transport Accident Commission, and that really talks to my emotions every time I talk about it. This is Alex, a 32-year-old male, married, having 2 young kids at the time that we were talking about this incident. He had a small business, employer of other people, and also a really fun man, having boating and fishing as hobbies, and also being in really good health. And his only vice was using sort of recreational drugs. So a really good life, I say, before the incident. On the evening of the incident I'm talking about, he was walking the family dog in the neighborhood, a 40K environment, and he was hit by a car at an intersection. The car was going a bit faster, and then Alex was seriously injured. He had an impact to his head, contusions, lacerations, broken hand, I guess broken arm, broken femur, and some dislocations and broken ribs. When we assessed injuries of Alex on the crash scene, he had 50% chance of dying as a result of the crash on the scene. He needed air ambulance to be taken to the trauma hospital and spent 40 days in hospital and outpatient, and we estimate over $1 million investment from the Transport Accident Commission to care for him for the rest of his life. However, serious injuries are not really stopping at the incident of crash or at the hospital. They continue to impact people's lives. So we have done some longitudinal study of Alex's life, and I'm going to share what happened to him at 6 months and 12 months point. So at 6 months, Alex was having really a slow recovery from the injuries. He had permanent scars and was continuously in pain. Also, he had grown a limp, was really anxious, and had stopped his hobbies. So this is 6 months mark after the crash. His life is not improving, going down, and we had a sort of hope that he would come back, he would bounce back. However, on the background of all the pain and anxiety, when we went back to Alex in 12 months, we heard that his marriage was ended. He was really socially withdrawn, no more hobbies for him. He was depressed, started gambling, lost the business, and was suicidal. So these are some of the impacts of road trauma on people's lives. So when we talk about micromobility or any sort of transport, we need to ensure that these are safe and accessible, good for everyone, good for these people, good for the society. So that's the essence of my talk today. So before moving on, I would like you to help me here. Have you or a person you know been involved in a crash, say less in the last 5 years? We've got around say 60, 70 people here, and I'm checking, we have, say, out of 5, 6, 7 people, 1 person saying no. So this is quite consistent with what I receive in different seminars. In our societies, at the year 2021, we are with directly or with one level of separation, 1 degree of separation, we are connected to one who is involved in a crash. So the matter is quite important. Now, I want to mention, as Julia and Josh and Tom mentioned, we have high hopes in micromobility and sustainable active transport for a reason. They can help us to do 3 things. First of all, by thinking better about how we manage the transport system, we might reduce the need for some travels. So working from home is amazing. That's what we're doing here. We're saving travel, good for everyone. Also, mode shift is quite essential. If we are taking trips away from cars to public transport or safer modes, like if you are riding your bike in a separated bike lane, that's a good mode shift. I'm going to discuss later today that some of the micromobility we have, they don't take away from cars. They potentially take from other active modes, and that is something that we need to be aware of. And also, planning is good, because when we're building new infrastructure, it's great to put things in the first place. Rectification is expensive. Putting it in the first place, amazing and cheap. Now, let's have a look at data. I've chosen 2 really good literature analyses that systematically analyzed quite a few different research. So I'm going to talk about just two, but there is research galore out there that you can find, and you can reach me and can tell you. The first one comes from University of British Columbia, and they did a systematic review of e-scooters injury. So what they did, they reviewed 28 scientific papers between 2010 and 2020, and 4 of them are from Australia and New Zealand, 13 of them are from US, and the rest of them from Europe. And what they did, they look at the emergency department data and also health and trauma systems data for understanding the mechanism behind e-scooter injury. So what they found, these are the 2 main findings that I want to share with you today. First of all, when you look at the e-scooter injuries, you see almost all of them are single road user injuries. And when you look at them more deeply, you see the majority of injury for e-scooters comes from falls. So that's very crucial to understand when we're designing the system for them. You see multiple party injuries here. These are when you have a car or a pedestrian or a cyclist involved. Also, when we look at the data and the mechanisms of injury, you see head and arms and hands are the biggest part or recipients of crash forces. So they fall, they hit the head. That's essentially what happens. Not surprising though. Now, in terms of rider behavior, these are the main findings that we found. 5% of people who were injured were wearing a helmet. Now, put things in context. Fall is the majority of injury. They fall and hit their head. They don't have a helmet. So not really commensurate to safety. Also, we've noticed if you have compulsory laws against, like for helmets, their rate increases from 5% to 64%, 70%, which is amazing. The other thing, and Tom really nicely talked about tourisms. What comes with tourism is the risk of them being a bit drunk, a bit using drugs, having fun. So that's also a risk factor that we need to consider. It doesn't mean that we need to stop it. It means that we need to design better infrastructure, better laws, and better policies to accommodate that. So the talk today is about micromobility is great, how we can make it even safer and better and more accessible. So I'm going to talk about that. Now, let me talk about a research I found, and that's maybe 18-20 European countries research, Road Safety Research Institute were interviewed and talked about the safety aspect of e-scooters. Now, so I talked about 18 countries contributed to this research, and what we found is in 80% of these countries, e-scooters are legal. Great. We also found in terms of categorization of e-scooters, in 40% of these countries, they are categorized as bicycles. In 27%, they have their own category, and in the rest of them, they don't have any category, so they cannot be really properly counted, or we cannot really understand the trauma. Also, we have 40% of the countries that in this research, they were interviewed, they didn't have any age restriction, but in 40% of them, they had an age restriction from 12 to 18, depending on the jurisdiction. And finally, in 70% of these countries, they had a maximum speed for e-scooters. Some of them had maximum speed for roads or footpaths or in different circumstances, but 70% of them, they have some restrictions. Now, let's continue. So this is very interesting. 55% of these countries have a restriction on maximum power. Of course, power means speed, speed means energy, energy means energy dissipation, and that means injury. So you see the link, so you know where the restriction comes from and what for. Also, this is very interesting because it says in like these 18 advanced EU countries, 16% of them allow e-scooters on footpaths and bike lanes. 11% just bike lane only, and 38% you can ride your e-scooter on bike lanes or traffic lanes. So not many countries allow e-scooter on footpath, or if they do, they have really strict limitations about the use and speed and all that. So we're going to talk about that a bit later as well. Also, only 11% of these jurisdictions need registration and insurance. There is a heated argument and conversation about some of these restrictions. Of course, we want to have more micromobility, so we want to choose policies that actually have a really good safety impact. We don't want to limit accessibility. We want to increase safety, and I think we can find a happy marriage. We definitely can. And also, 22% of these countries have compulsory helmet. Now, let's have a look at the safety aspect of this research. So 18 countries in Europe, what's their opinion on safety? So 55% of these countries say, hey, e-scooters take away from public transport and walking. So they're not actually creating a mode shift. 45%, they didn't have data. So we need to be really careful when we say a micromobility make mode shift. We need to know which mode we're taking from and what is the safety impact. 1 point. The other one is in 61% of these countries, a road trauma for e-scooters is not identifiable in the trauma systems. So that's crazy because we cannot study them. We cannot understand where they are, how they happen, how we can stop them. Data is crucial. So that's one of the recommendations that I'm going to talk about later today. Also, this is coming from the city of Oslo in Norway, and they did a comparison between e-scooter riders and cyclists. E-scooter riders in Oslo have 11 times more likelihood to be involved in crashes. This is really interesting for us to consider. Again, it doesn't mean that we need to restrict. It means that we need to provide safer infrastructure. Now, let's have a look at risk factors. And these are 5 major risk factors that some of the studies have pointed to. There are many more. I'm going to talk about that with you later, but let me talk about these 5. Road surface, very important. We talked about falls. Surface is bad, they fall. Inexperience, again, very important. Speeding, we've seen speeding causing crash for e-scooters, and also riding under influence, drugs and alcohol, crucial. And finally, distraction. As my friends here mentioned, some of these e-scooter riders are tourists, some of them are new to areas, they can get distracted. So we need to develop better infrastructure to help these people to be safer. Now, I want your participation again. So, have you ever ridden an e-scooter? So, yes, no, no. Cool. So we're talking about around maybe 55%, maybe 50%, 40%. Okay, more zeros now. Okay, 40%. Roughly 40% of the participants here have ridden e-scooters. I have ridden e-scooter in New Zealand and in my pre-COVID holidays in Moscow. That was the first time I saw e-scooters. Now, help me please here. People who have ridden e-scooters, what safety risk have you encountered in your personal experience? Not talking about research, what other people say here, say your experience. What kind of safety risk you have encountered? A slippery surface, Benjamin. Pavement defects, Michael. Yes, low barriers, yeah, potholes, dodging pedestrians. Yeah, so the first few comments are talking about pavements, surface quality, a space for them to ride, lack of curb ramps. Yes, ADA is also very important. So very interesting. The majority of comments are talking about pavement and infrastructure and narrow paths. Yet we want a space for these people to use. poorly maintained device. I gathered that is the e-scooter. Okay, so really good. So nothing that is not known by research. That's great. That's great confidence to us. Now let me talk about e-scooters through the safe system lens. Now, before giving you some solution or some advice or some recommendations, I want to walk you through the safe system approach. So the safe system approach is about at least 4 key principles. The first one is human fallibility. Julia mentioned, Josh mentioned, we have people. People make mistakes. It's quite human to make mistakes. We need to allow and design the system for those mistakes. Fantastic. But also human beings are vulnerable. We all are vulnerable. Like there is a certain level of trauma or force that we can tolerate. And then you need to remember, it's not just e-scooters. The pedestrian, children, elderly, different level of capability hit by a scooter, they have also a level of tolerance. Also, an e-scooter hit by a bike or a car have a certain level of tolerance. So you need to consider this. Also, it's about shared responsibility. Shared responsibility is all about, just excuse me, I want to, okay, fantastic. I'm using GoTo for the first time today, so there are so many screens here. Okay, so shared responsibility is we're walking away from blaming e-scooter riders. If there's anyone to blame, is the authorities and people who design and run the system. So let's be really clear about that. Also, let's be clear that if we want to have a response, it should be all the aspects. It should be about road and street and road user and vehicle and speed and trauma system. So that is the umbrella that I'm going to talk about today. Now, let's have a look at practical aspect of the safe system. So when you have an e-scooter in interaction with cars or bicycle or pedestrians, there are 3 ways that you can ensure their safety. First, by managing the severity of risk, which is mainly about speed management. Second is by managing the crash risk. This is human factor. By managing confusion, by helping people to make better decisions, and by managing crash, we can reduce the potential bad outcomes. And also by managing exposure. Let me give you more specific comments here. So for injury severity, the research tells us if you drop the impact speed of a pedestrian hit by a car from 50 to 30, you reduce the likelihood for serious trauma from 83 to around 30. That is pure science. That's human physics. That's it. It means that now all over the world, we are aspiring for 30 kilometers per hour where we have pedestrians and e-scooters and bikes mixing the traffic. Crash management, how we manage crash. There are very specific ways we can manage crash. First of all, remove conflict points. If you have a conflict point between e-scooters and cars or e-scooters and vulnerable pedestrians, remove them. Or minimize them. If you cannot fully remove them, minimize them. Or reduce the area of conflict. So have like really channelized ways that conflict is managed in space and time. Also, reduce vehicle speed when you have conflict. That's very important. And better human factor design. More and more and more in our sciences and in our traffic engineering practice, we use human factor, and that's fantastic. Now, let me give you an example. We all are familiar with the Dutch roundabout design. This example comes from UK adoption of the design. This looks safe, but let me tell you why it is safe. Firstly, as you see, we have fewer conflict points compared to a typical roundabout or an intersection. First reason. Secondly, a roundabout reduces the speed because of creating a barrier on your way you cannot barrel through. So it reduces speed and changes the angle. Also, this design is 1 lane per leg. So you see, you don't have 2 legs. So we manage the space, we channelize. Also, we have raised pedestrian crossings, amazing, reduces the speed, gives more prominence to pedestrians. We have separated bicycle lanes, needless to say, they're safe, and it has better human factor design. When you drive, ride, or walk through these facilities, you know what is expected from you. Fantastic. Now, how we manage exposure? Very simple. We either time separate vulnerable road users. This is like, having separate traffic phases at a traffic signal, or we space separate, we put them in a different level, that's manage exposure, or we move e-scooters or cyclists away from heavy traffic areas to like nicer, like local streets, or we reduce number of cars by mode shift. So essentially, we move away from such streets to such environments. Now, we talked about quite a few different reasons and risk factors and underlying principles that cause e-scooter safety problems. What is the solution? Our solution, or my recommendation today to you, has 5 pillars. And the pillars are safe streets, safe speed, safe riders, safe e-scooters, and post-crash care. Let me tell you more. In terms of safe street, we want to have better surfaces. Full point. 95% of single road user crashes for e-scooters is because of bad surface. I believe they fall because also inexperience, but like surface is important. Also, separate e-scooters from traffic and pets. I've got double stars here. That means that if you want to allow sharing the space with cars, reduce the speed to 30k or lower. If you want to allow e-scooters on footpaths with pedestrians, imagine a child, an elderly person there, reduce the speed, I would say 10 or lower. So you can play with it, but if you have a space, put them there in a separate space with bike and have some rules, and that might be better. Save the speed, 30k, needless to say, 30k is the limit, and maximum speed for e-scooters is crucial. 15 to 20k is what the European research tells us. Safe riders, I suggest compulsory helmet use. Falls are crucial. They hit the head, they bump their heads, use the helmet. Of course, helmet doesn't cover everything, but it's better than nothing. Also, we want restrictions around alcohol and drug use. Finally, if you have limited power for e-scooters, and the other, I think, more important thing, what we have is bad pavement, some inexperienced e-scooters, and we have these wobbly instruments. Have a better design for e-scooters. They are more stable, people fall less, we have less injuries. And finally, we need data, and we need to understand the injury mechanisms. Let's collect data, and let's analyze the data, and let's data talk. So with that, thank you all, great to be here, and just passing on the baton back to David.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. Now we will move on. David, would you like to move ahead with the questions, or?
Yes, let's hear a few questions. There's a lot of questions there.
Yes, there are.
So someone is suggesting there that all bikes and other PMD devices should be in a separate category and not too specific in the regulations. How do the four of you react to that suggestion?
If I can jump in quickly, my only concern would be if we have like that confusion, we cannot have a specific data for e-scooter safety matters to be able to analyze them. So in that sense, having exclusive categories would be good.
Cool. Also, someone is suggesting here that rather than power being the limiting factor, it should be speed, which is controlled through the Internet of Things, and that power is required for hills and heavy riders and cargo. Any comments on that suggestion?
I think,
We're very supportive of that also.
Yeah, I think that is still any way that you can stop people from speeding or, I guess, encourage responsible riding be the best approach.
Thomas?
Yeah, we're very supportive of that. Shared devices are controlled by speed, speed limits, slow zones, no-go zones. So the power is used to get up hills and for heavier users. And so I can understand with personal devices, there may be some challenges, but that comes back to, what's allowed to be imported.
And also, if I can butt in quickly, there is a sort of gradation of power. So in many European countries, you have different power limits. So when we talk about power, we need to be really careful what level of power is required for different environments and have the limitation. So I agree with both Tom and Josh here, but I also say there is a spectrum of power.
Cool. There was a comment back here about what's more important. Is it more important to get consistency between the states in terms of the road rules, or is it more important to just ensure safety in each state?
I think I'll speak to that a little bit because RACV has called for national consistency. I think the ideal situation would be both, but we're getting to the point now where that's going to be a little bit more difficult as Brisbane has the ridables road rules, which and the Australian road rules are working towards the PMD segment, which will include e-scooters. So national consistency is a bit of a challenge to achieve, but ideally I think safety needs to come first. If we can have safe outcomes in terms of and national consistency, that should be what we strive towards.
Cool. Any other comments?
I would say that the biomechanics of human body doesn't change by jurisdiction. So in that sense, I agree with Josh that some rules should be universal. Also, I agree with both, my colleagues here that different environments might require different specifications. But remember, injury doesn't change by jurisdiction.
Okay, we had another comment from Carl about insurance for e-scooter riders. And because e-scooter riders seem to end up in hospital more than other people considering their exposure, should they be required to make a contribution to, in Victoria, the Transport Accident Commission, or in other states, similar insurance schemes before given access to our streets? What do you think about that, Thomas and Joshua?
I'll go first. So in our submission, our initial submission to the National Transport Commission, we stated that we would be supportive and we encourage them to consider TAC's role, or the role of TAC, much like in the past couple of years, I think bicycles were incorporated into the TAC structure. And we, from our perspective, we think that's an area that definitely needs to be looked at, whether it's TAC or whether it's an insurance agency, it definitely needs to be looked at.
Cool. So in terms of where e-scooters would be used or allowed to be used, what about CBD footpaths? Would you be in favour of using e-scooters on footpaths in CBD type areas?
I'll go first.
Maybe Hafez, or Joshua first and then Hafez.
Yeah, our stance towards this was that in all circumstances, pedestrians should come first and foremost. So what we advocated was, yes, e-scooters could use and operate on footpaths, as there are limitations to the infrastructure in Victoria, particularly around safe separated shared paths and bicycle paths. However, we do think that it is in the utmost important that e-scooter riders give way to pedestrians. And I know that's a difficult thing to raise, but in a busy place like the CBD, we would encourage people to use a shared path or a bicycle path if applicable. If not, then yeah, we give way to pedestrians.
So can I want to think out of the box. Back in 2010, I did my PhD in the CBD of Melbourne, and I spent so many days and nights walking the streets of the CBD. Back then, we had this idea that this environment is not designed for 50K. Now in 2021, almost all the major CBDs in Europe are 30K with 15K for specific areas. Why don't we bring down the speed in the CBD of Melbourne to 30K with 10Ks or 15Ks on littered streets, and then unleash micromobility? Good for micromobility, good for safety, good for businesses. And can I say muck cars? I just said it.
Okay, I think we've got room for just one more question about Arrivo. Julia, how will Arrivo fare compared to Google? Google already has the ability to do bike planning. How does Arrivo compare?
Yeah, and what will Google do next? Look, and I have pinged the person who asked that question separately, but what I would say is that what a Victorian-based journey planning app allows you to do is be hyperlocal. So if you look at the pop-up bike lane infrastructure that came up in Melbourne, we had it in Arrivo that day. You won't get that in Google. So the ability to adjust to local conditions and to preference routes based off Melbourne or Victoria and what is unique to that market is something that Arrivo can do. If Google decides to throw down and do, specific bike planning routes unique to every individual city, then, Google will do what it's going to do. But at the moment, what we are able to do is take that hyperlocal approach and feed in information. So, for example, we did work with City of Melbourne, City of Yarra and City of Port Phillip as part of Let's Ride Melbourne to get their specific feedback on that feature as well. So that's the differentiator at the moment. And over the next couple of months, hopefully, IT development pending will also have a feature which enables you to pick a safer or a faster route as well. So we'll continue to invest in it. As to whether or not, we keep ahead of Google, I can't answer that.
Cool. Joshua, did you want to add anything?
No, I think Julia hit the nail on the head with that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Something else, Joshua? Go.
Oh, no, that's it.
All right. Look, I think we might call things to a close at this time. I might hand back to Sarah just to close things out.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much for our wonderful speakers, and thank you very much for your time. Many thanks to the audience and the great questions. And thank you very much, David, for managing the question and answer session. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice evening, and looking forward to meeting you in the next seminar. Thank you.